Most of y'all know by now that I'm a bit of a condition snob when it comes to collecting comics, but unless you're looking and buying 9.8, 9.9, or perfect 10s, every comic's going to have some degree of defect, something wrong with it that knocks that grade down a little bit. So in this video, I want to talk about various defects and what my opinion is on each one and how it impacts my decision to buy a book or not. Happy day, everyone. It's Kevin. Welcome once again to Doc's Comics. And as I said in the intro, I want to talk a little bit about grading and about comic book defects. Now, before we go too deep into this, it is all relative. I will cover this in a little while, but there are only a few defects that are absolute deal breakers for me. That if something in particular is wrong with it, I am not going to look at it. I'm not going to buy the book. Every other grade has varying degrees. Some of it is very slight, some of it is very heavy, and there's everything in the middle. So it's all relative, as I'm sure as it is to most of you. Every single one of us is trying to get the highest possible grade possible, to be redundant, at the set price that we're willing to set. And I've talked about setting prices when it comes to buying books on a number of different videos. We all know that price dictates what you can get and what you can't. And as a rule of thumb, the bigger the book, the more expensive the book is, based on your budget anyway, the more defects that you are willing to allow, unless you're just a hardcore 9.8 or bust kind of person. I mean, some take like $100. There's plenty of books that I can get at 9.4, 9.6 for $100. But if $100 is my budget, other books I might only be able to afford a fine or a very good or even less than that. And so the key is to try to find again that perfect cross between condition and price. Of course, scarcity is also important on this. I mean, I am willing to make some concessions if a book is in a lower grade than perhaps I want for my collection, but it appears so infrequently that it's time to pull the trigger. And in the worst case scenario, you can use it as a placeholder until you ultimately can find one that is higher grade than that. Lots of examples of this. Again, if I'm looking at a low number Fantastic Four, say something under issue 30, they are pretty hard to find, and finding them in higher grade is relatively difficult as well. So you do have to make concessions. If I'm looking for a New Mutants 98, for example, a reasonably new book. I know it's 30 years old these days, but it's still new and there's still a lot of books in high grade. And assuming my budget is high enough, I'm not going to settle for a mid-grade copy of that. And that's just me. Again, your mileage may differ. But with a book, say like a Fantastic Four 16, which is an Ant-Man crossover and a Doctor Doom crossover, while you do see books, you don't see them in terribly high grade. And of course, that is an expensive book as well. So you do, as I said, have to make concessions. So what's the price? What's the highest grade that I can afford at that price? But as I said, and as we get into this, all of it depends. Virtually every single defect is just dependent upon what I'm looking for. So with that being said, let's jump into some of these comic defects, and I'm going to start with three of them that are absolute deal breakers for me. My first deal breaker is insect or rodent damage of some kind, or as I like to collectively call it, rat chew. That phrase was used in the Overstreet Collecting Guide, and it still kind of sticks in my head to this day. Of course, just like with all of these defects, the damage from rodent or insect bites, consumption, chewing, whatever you want to call it, can be mild or it can be pretty doggone severe. But in either case, it essentially takes material away from it. The rats will usually chew up the edges, chew up the corners. The insects can also do that, but sometimes they get in the paper and they burrow little channels in the paper as well. The damage is pretty obvious. It definitely hurts the eye appeal of the book quite a bit. And so I try to stay away from any kind of animal damage at all. Another big no-no for me is rusty staples. Rusty staples in and of themselves aren't necessarily bad, but once a staple starts to rust, there really isn't anything that you can do about it. I suppose you can try to take a little piece of steel wool and scrape the rust off there, but you're taking a risk damaging the book unless you want to take the staples out. I don't like taking the staples out at all. And I don't know if this is for sure. Maybe you can comment on this below if you know, but I think that that can count as restoration if you remove the rust from original staples. But the main reason I don't like rusty staples is that once it gets severe, that rust can spread onto the paper and it can create a lot of dark, ugly stains on the pages themselves. And so if I see just the slightest hint of staple rust, I stay away. The third one I avoid, and y'all might disagree with me on this one. Y'all might disagree with me on a lot of these, as a matter of fact, but I don't like detached covers. One staple pull I can deal with, and I'll cover one staple pull a little later in this video. But if both are pulled and the cover is just loose on there, I just don't. I don't like it. It's a personal thing as much as anything. And usually, if the cover has been removed, there's other subsidiary damage in and around the book as well, which accumulates to make the book probably lower grade than I want, and a detached cover knocks the grade down considerably. Now, it might be at your price point, and that's perfectly great. All of us do this differently, but for me, a detached cover is something I also try to stay away from. I'm going to move on now to the it depends category. And as I said at the beginning of the video, um, all defects have some degree of severity. Some of it's mild, some of it's not. And a lot of this just depends on how severe the defect actually is. And the first one I'm going to start with is one that I really thought about putting in the deal breaker category, but there might be rare exceptions that I might make, and that's tape on the cover. Um, that's a relatively common defect, and it's one that you see a lot in older books, more perhaps than newer books. Sometimes they have, most of the time when you see tape, it's going to be on the spine to hold the book together. It might be like vertical, horizontal pieces of tape, like two or three of them on the spine, or in fact, you might see an entire piece of tape that goes all the way up the spine. But there are other places that you can put tape as well. Um, Tape isn't bad in and of itself, but over time, what it does do is discolor the book. It kind of can get yellowish or brownish, and it really can hurt the eye appeal of the book. And I am all about eye appeal with my collection that I like to keep relatively high grade. So most of the time, 90% of the time, no tape, but every once in a while, if it's not too bad, I might make an exception. Second in this category, I'm going to put subscription crease. This one, how this impacts people varies widely. Some people it doesn't bother at all. Some people it bothers quite a bit. And I would say I fit somewhere in the middle. If you don't know, in the 60s, mostly when Marvel would mail its subscription copies to people who subscribed and got their books by mail, what they would do is they would fold it in half and mail it that way, so, which would leave a very large crease down the middle of the entire book. Sometimes that crease breaks color and sometimes it doesn't. And when it doesn't break cover, there are some of them that are relatively mild that you really can't see very well, but there are some more severe instances where it does break color the entire way, both on the front and the back cover, and I really don't like that at all. So if it's a mild subscription crease, I might pick a book up, particularly if it's an expensive book and it gives me a nice discount on it. Otherwise, I try to stay away from it, but subscription creases are another one of those it depends. I know I'm not going to include every defect on here. Invariably, there's going to be one that I leave out. And if I leave enough of them out, leave a comment and maybe I could do a second video on this. But a third one that I'll add to this list is a detached centerfold, whether it's one staple, which technically isn't detached, or both staples where it is detached. It doesn't bother me as much as a detached cover would. Part of it is probably because it's out of sight and it doesn't, I keep using the term eye appeal, but it doesn't disturb the eye appeal if you're just looking at the book when it's in its bag and board. It's not a defect that a lot of people necessarily like. One staple out, of course, is less severe than the entire one out, but you can just sort of squirrel it away. And as long as you line that centerfold up with the rest of the book, it's not going to get damage on the edges when it's stored or anything like that. It's one that I would prefer to avoid, but it's not an absolute deal breaker. Fourth on this list, since I already talked about detached covers, let's talk about a blown staple. And a blown staple means that the cover is detached at one staple, so it's still holding on. This one, again, there are varying degrees of this. I've seen blown staples that are so terrible that they leave big old tears and gaps, and it just takes away from the eye appeal altogether. And there are some that are very subtle that you would actually have to take the book out and open it up and look at it to even know that the staple is detached. It's it's very subtle in that regard. But nevertheless, it is a blown staple and it is going to knock down on the grade of the book. As I told you, eye appeal is a big deal for me, and if it's not too bad, I won't necessarily hesitate to buy a book, particularly if it's one that I don't see very much and that I might be able to upgrade and use it as a placeholder in the meantime. So one staple isn't nearly as big a deal for me as both staples, i.e. a detached cover. I'm going to do one more of these because if I include every single comic book defect, this is going to be an hour-long video. I don't want to do an hour-long video, and chances are you don't want to watch an hour-long video. I mean, there's plenty of other defects. There's things like corner corner creases and spine ticks that are everywhere in comics. They're much more common defects. And so maybe I can spend time doing another video on more common defects. But the last one that sort of it depends for me that I'll include in this video is the dreaded tape pull. The tape pulls happen to every single one of us, I would suspect, at one point or another, assuming that you use tape. And if you don't use tape, power to you. I don't know how you do it. It would be a nightmare for me. But a tape pull, very simply, is when you accidentally get a piece of tape on the cover, and in the attempt to try to remove the tape, you pull off some color from the cover, and it leaves kind of a white, rough spot on the cover. Um, for tape pulls, for me, and I suspect this is exactly the same way it is for all of you, it just depends on the location of the tape pull and the severity of the tape pull. Some are very, very minor, really tiny, you can barely see it. I mean, you have to actually be looking for it to see the tape pull, and there are some that are really, really big and take up a big chunk of a part of the cover. Similarly, when it comes to location, if the tape pull happens to be just on the side or in a corner or hiding away somewhere, not as big a deal, whereas if it's right on the middle of Spider-Man's face, everybody's going to see it, and it's going to kill that once again eye appeal that I've talked about many, many times on this. So it also depends on the severity of the spine, the tape pull. I'll get it right here. Depends on the severity of the tape pull in addition to the location of this tape pull. To finish this video on a good note, there is one defect actually that not only doesn't bother me at all, but in fact, I like it. I prefer it, and that's the date stamp. Now, CGC and others would tell you that the date stamp is not a defect. And I would agree, but for many it does count as a defect. And the reason I like date stamps is that it gives the book some provenance. It gives a little bit of history to the book. If you're looking at an old Silver Age book and it has a stamp on it that says August the 3rd, 1966, you know that that's the date that that book came to the newsstand. They put that stamp on it for the arrival date. So it does add a cool little bit of history, a cool little bit of provenance to it that I think is really cool. The only exception to that, and it does happen once in a while, is that the date stamp is just in the worst possible place on the cover, right on their face or right in the center or somewhere that's very, very obtrusive. And that might be a little bit of a downside for me. But most of the time, if the date stamp is somewhere that's relatively inobtrusive, not only does it not bother me, but I actually do like it. So this has ended up being a very incomplete video on comic defects. It gives me room to do another one, especially if the demand is relatively high and if you seem to like this video. So I hope that proved to be a little bit informative. You know a little bit about my quirks when it comes to particular defects. I hope you enjoyed this video. As per always, I'll see you on the next one. Please like, subscribe, comment, everything else that's related to that. Otherwise, I will see you all at the next one. You have a delightful day.